The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the Los Angeles courthouse, casting long shadows across the marble floors. People rushed past in all directions, lawyers in expensive suits carrying leather briefcases, families nervously clutching papers, court officers directing traffic with practiced efficiency. It was just another Tuesday in one of the busiest courthouses in California. In courtroom 7B, Judge Patricia Morrison sat behind her massive wooden bench, reviewing the day's cases. She'd been a judge for over 2 decades, and in that time, she'd seen just about everything. Or so she thought. At 57 years old, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a tight bun and reading glasses perched on her nose, she ran her courtroom with an iron fist. Lawyers knew better than to show up unprepared in her courtroom. The bailiff called out the next case number, and the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. A young man walked in and immediately heads turned. He looked barely old enough to drive, let alone be in a courtroom. His suit was at least 2 sizes too big, the sleeves covering half his hands and the pants bunching up at his ankles. The tie around his neck sat slightly crooked, like he'd learned how to tie it from a YouTube video that morning. He carried a battered leather briefcase that looked like it had survived a few decades of hard use. His dark hair was neatly combed but still had that youthful uncertainty to it. As he walked down the center aisle toward the front of the courtroom, his footsteps echoed in the sudden silence. Every eye in the room followed him. The prosecutor, Gerald Hutchins, was already seated at his table. He was a man in his early 50s with graying temples and the confident air of someone who'd won hundreds of cases. When he saw the teenager approaching, he leaned over to his assistant and whispered something that made her stifle a laugh. In the gallery, a few spectators exchanged confused glances. An elderly woman in the back row leaned toward her neighbor and muttered, "Is that the defendant? He looks like he should be in school." The young man reached the defense table and set down his briefcase with a soft thud. He stood there for a moment, his hands fidgeting slightly with the handle of the case. Judge Morrison looked up from her papers, her eyes narrowing as she took in the sight before her. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the murmurs in the courtroom. "Are you lost? This is a courtroom, not a career day event." A few people in the gallery laughed. The bailiff cracked a slight smile before catching himself and returning to his stone-faced professional demeanor. The young man cleared his throat. "No, Your Honor, I'm exactly where I need to be." Judge Morrison removed her glasses and pinched the bridge of her nose, a gesture she often made when her patience was being tested. "Young man, I'm going to ask you one more time. Where's the defense attorney for this case? And where are your parents?" The teenager straightened his shoulders and looked directly at the judge. Despite his nervous appearance, his voice came out steady and clear. "Your Honor, I am the defense attorney. My name is Daniel Kim, and I'm representing Mr. Robert Williams in this matter." The courtroom exploded with noise. Laughter erupted from multiple directions. Someone in the back actually clapped, thinking it was some kind of joke. The prosecutor shook his head in disbelief, a smug grin spreading across his face. Even the court reporter looked up from her machine with raised eyebrows. Judge Morrison's face turned a deep shade of red. She slammed her gavel down 3 times, the sharp cracks echoing through the room. "Order, order in this court." The noise died down, but the tension remained thick in the air. "This is highly inappropriate," Judge Morrison said, her voice ice cold. "I don't know what kind of prank this is or if someone put you up to this, but I will not tolerate any disrespect in my courtroom. Bailiff, please escort this young man out and find out who—" "Your Honor, if I may," Daniel interrupted, his voice polite but firm. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a card. "I'd like to submit my California State Bar credentials for verification." He walked forward and handed the card to the clerk, a middle-aged woman who'd worked in the courthouse for 15 years. She took it with a skeptical expression, fully expecting it to be fake. But as she examined it under her desk lamp, her face changed. Her eyes widened. She looked at the card again, then at Daniel, then back at the card. "Your Honor," the clerk said quietly, "I need to speak with you." Judge Morrison waved her hand impatiently. "Just tell me it's fake so we can move on." The clerk walked up to the bench and whispered something in the judge's ear. Whatever she said made Judge Morrison's expression shift from anger to confusion to something like shock. "That's impossible," the judge muttered. "I verified it 3 times. The clerk whispered back, "It's legitimate." Judge Morrison stared at Daniel for a long moment. The entire courtroom held its breath, sensing that something unexpected was unfolding. The prosecutor stood up. "Your Honor, surely this is some kind of mistake. The defense can't possibly be represented by Mr. Hutchins." Judge Morrison cut him off, her voice uncharacteristically uncertain. "It appears we have an unusual situation here. I'm calling a 15-minute recess while I verify these credentials personally." She stood abruptly, her robes swishing as she disappeared through the door behind her bench. The courtroom erupted in confused chatter once again. People pulled out their phones, whispering to each other, trying to figure out what was happening. Daniel stood alone at the defense table, his oversized suit sleeves still covering his hands, but his chin held high. He knew what everyone was thinking. He'd faced this reaction before, but this time he wasn't backing down. This time he was going to prove them all wrong. During the recess, Daniel sat quietly at the defense table while chaos swirled around him. People were pulling out their phones, searching for information, whispering theories to each other. The prosecutor kept glancing over at him with a mixture of disbelief and irritation. But Daniel had learned to tune out the stares and whispers. He'd been dealing with them his whole life. Behind the scenes, Judge Morrison was in her chambers making urgent phone calls. She called the state bar directly, spoke to 3 different officials, and even had them email her verification documents. Every single check came back the same way. Daniel Kim was indeed a licensed attorney in the state of California, at 17 years old. What nobody in that courtroom knew yet was the story behind this impossible situation. Daniel's journey to that courtroom had started almost a decade earlier, when he was just 8 years old. His father had been a truck driver, working long hours to support their small family. One night there was an accident. Someone had been hurt and Daniel's father was blamed. The case went to trial, but they couldn't afford a good lawyer. The public defender assigned to them was overwhelmed with cases, barely had time to meet with them, and missed critical details that could have proven his father's innocence. Daniel watched his father get sentenced to 5 years in prison for something he didn't do. He saw his mother cry every night. He felt the weight of injustice settle on his small shoulders like a heavy blanket he couldn't shake off. While other kids his age were playing baseball or video games, Daniel started spending his weekends at the public library. He pulled thick legal books off the shelves, books that were bigger than his backpack. The librarian, an older woman named Mrs. Chen, noticed this peculiar kid reading case law and court procedures. She started helping him find more resources, teaching him how to use the library's legal database. Daniel became obsessed. He read everything he could about criminal law, appeals, procedural errors. He learned terms that most adults never encounter. By the time he was 9, he'd written a letter to an Innocence Project outlining the mistakes in his father's case. They were so impressed by the detail and legal reasoning in that letter that they took on the case. It took 2 years, but they eventually got his father's conviction overturned. That experience changed Daniel forever. He realized that the law could be a powerful tool, but only if you knew how to use it. And he realized that too many people, especially poor people, never got the justice they deserved because they couldn't afford lawyers who cared enough to dig deep. School became easy for Daniel after that. While his teachers taught basic math, he was already studying advanced calculus online. While his classmates learned to write 5-paragraph essays, he was drafting legal briefs for practice. His school counselors didn't know what to do with him. They'd never had a student like this before. By the time he was 13, Daniel had finished high school through an accelerated program. He'd taken every AP test available and scored perfectly on all of them. Universities started reaching out, offering him spots in their undergraduate programs. But Daniel had no interest in wasting time on a regular college degree. He wanted to study law, and he wanted to start now. Most law schools wouldn't even consider him. They had age requirements, prerequisite degrees, standards that existed for good reasons. But Stanford Law School had a special program for exceptional cases, students who demonstrated not just intelligence, but a genuine understanding of legal principles. Daniel applied with a portfolio that included legal analysis of 50 major cases, an essay on systemic problems in public defense, and letters of recommendation from 3 judges his father's case had too. They accepted him at 14 years old. Law school was brutal. Daniel was younger than everyone, shorter than most, and faced constant doubt from professors and classmates alike. Study groups didn't want him. Other students assumed he was some rich kid whose parents had bought his way in. During mock trials, opposing counsel would make jokes about his age, trying to rattle him. But Daniel had something most law students didn't have. He had a reason. Every time he read about a wrongful conviction, he saw his father's face. Every time he studied a case about inadequate legal defense, he remembered his mother's tears. That fire kept him going when everyone around him doubted. He graduated from Stanford Law at 17, one of the youngest law school graduates in California history. The ceremony was surreal. While his former middle school classmates were getting ready for prom, Daniel was receiving a law degree. The local news even did a story on him, calling him a genius and a prodigy. But getting a law degree and passing the bar exam were just the beginning. The real challenge was getting someone to take him seriously. Daniel applied to dozens of law firms. Most never responded. The ones that did respond sent polite rejection letters, thanking him for his interest but explaining that they needed attorneys with experience. Some were honest enough to admit that clients would never trust someone who looked like he should be in high school. For months after passing the bar exam, Daniel sat in his small apartment, watching his savings dwindle, wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake. Maybe he should have waited, built up some credibility somehow, found a different path. Then he got a call from a legal aid clinic. They had a case nobody else would touch. A homeless veteran named Robert Williams was being charged with theft. The evidence seemed overwhelming. The man had no money for a real defense. The public defender's office was so backlogged that they could barely give the case more than a few hours of attention. It was exactly the kind of case that had destroyed Daniel's father. The kind of case where an innocent person gets crushed by a system that's too busy to care. Daniel took the case immediately. He spent 3 weeks working 20-hour days, reviewing every piece of evidence, tracking down every witness, following every lead. He maxed out his credit card hiring an investigator for 2 days. He knocked on doors in rough neighborhoods, talked to people everyone else had ignored, built a timeline that nobody else had bothered to create, and he found something. Something big. Something that would change everything. Now here he sat in Judge Morrison's courtroom, wearing a borrowed suit that didn't fit, carrying his grandfather's old briefcase, ready to prove that justice wasn't about age or appearance. It was about truth. And Daniel knew the truth. Judge Morrison returned to the courtroom after what felt like an eternity. Her face was unreadable as she settled into her chair behind the bench. The room fell silent instantly. Everyone leaned forward, waiting to hear what would happen next. After thorough verification, the judge began, her voice measured and careful. I can confirm that Mr. Daniel Kim is indeed a licensed attorney in good standing with the California State Bar. She paused, letting that information sink in. However, I want to make something absolutely clear. This court maintains the highest standards. Any mistakes, any procedural errors, any sign that this defendant is not receiving adequate representation, and I will declare a mistrial immediately. Do you understand, Mr. Kim? Daniel stood up. Yes, Your Honor. I understand completely. Very well, Judge Morrison said, though her tone suggested she still had serious doubts. Let's proceed with opening statements. Mr. Hutchins, you may begin. The prosecutor stood up with the confidence of a man who'd done this 1,000 times before. He buttoned his suit jacket and walked toward the jury box, making eye contact with each juror as he passed. His opening statement was smooth and polished, like a well-rehearsed performance. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Hutchins began, his voice rich and authoritative. This is a simple case, a straightforward case. On the evening of March 15th, the defendant, Robert Williams, walked into Sam's Corner store on 5th Street. Security cameras captured him entering the store. The store clerk, who was working that evening, watched him pocket multiple items without paying. When confronted, the defendant fled. Police found him 3 blocks away with stolen merchandise in his backpack. Hutchins held up enlarged photos of security camera footage, pointing to a grainy image of a man near the store's entrance. We have video evidence. We have eyewitness testimony. We have the stolen items recovered from the defendant's possession. This case is about accountability, about consequences for actions, about protecting honest business owners from theft. The evidence will show beyond any reasonable doubt that Robert Williams is guilty of retail theft. Thank you. He returned to his seat, looking pleased with himself. A few jurors nodded slightly. It did sound pretty straightforward. Now it was Daniel's turn. He stood up and suddenly that nervous teenager from earlier seemed to disappear. Something shifted in his posture and the way he held himself. He walked toward the jury with steady steps, his voice clear and strong. "Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Daniel Kim, and I'm here to represent Robert Williams. Mr. Hutchins just told you this is a simple case, a straightforward case. But here's what I've learned in studying law. When prosecutors say a case is simple, it usually means they haven't looked at it carefully enough." Daniel moved closer to the jury box. Robert Williams is a 62-year-old veteran who served this country for 8 years. He's been homeless for the past 3 years, not because he wants to be, but because life dealt him some hard blows. PTSD from his service, medical bills he couldn't pay, circumstances that could happen to anyone. He paused, making sure he had their attention. "The prosecutor showed you a blurry image from a security camera. He told you the store clerk identified my client. He mentioned items found in a backpack. But here's what he didn't tell you. He didn't tell you about the 5-minute gap in that security footage. He didn't tell you about the witness who saw Mr. Williams 2 blocks away, during the exact time this theft supposedly happened. He didn't tell you that the police never actually verified that those items came from that specific store." Daniel's voice grew more passionate. "This isn't about letting criminals go free. This is about making sure we have the right person. Because once you convict someone, you can't take it back. And I'm going to show you with evidence the police never bothered to find that Robert Williams is innocent." "Thank you." As Daniel returned to his seat, the courtroom was different than before. People weren't smirking anymore. The jurors looked interested, curious even. Judge Morrison was watching Daniel with a new expression. Not quite respect yet, but no longer dismissive. The trial began in earnest. Hutchins called his first witness, the store clerk who claimed to have seen the theft. The clerk was a young man in his 20s, nervous about being in court. He fidgeted with his hands as Hutchins asked him questions. "Can you tell us what you saw on the evening of March 15th? Hutchins asked. "Yeah, I was working the evening shift," the clerk said. "This homeless guy came in, started browsing around. I kept an eye on him because, we have problems with theft. I saw him put stuff in his pockets and then try to leave without paying." "And do you see that person in this courtroom today?" The clerk pointed at Robert Williams. "Yes, that's him right there." Hutchins smiled. "Thank you. No further questions." Now it was Daniel's turn to cross-examine. He stood up slowly, holding a notepad. When he spoke, his voice was gentle, almost friendly. "Good afternoon. I know being in court can be stressful, so I'll try to make this quick. You said you saw the man put items in his pockets, correct?" "Yes, that's right. How far away were you standing?" The clerk thought for a moment. "Maybe 20-25 feet. I was behind the counter." "And the store was busy that evening?" "Pretty busy, yeah." "It was around dinner time." Daniel nodded, walking closer. "So you were helping other customers, running the register, doing your job?" "Well, yeah, of course. But you were also watching my client the entire time." I kept glancing over. Daniel pulled out a document. "According to the register receipts, you processed 17 transactions between 6 and 7 p.m. That's 1 customer every 3.5 minutes. Is that correct?" The clerk shifted uncomfortably. "I guess so." "So while you were scanning items, taking money, giving change, making small talk with customers, you were simultaneously watching my client closely enough to see exactly what he was doing?" "I noticed when he took the stuff." "You noticed. But you didn't actually watch him continuously, did you?" "Well, no, but..." "And the lighting in that back corner of the store where you claim you saw him taking items, isn't that the area with the flickering fluorescent light that still hasn't been fixed?" The clerk blinked. "How did you know about that?" "I visited the store. I spoke to your manager. I looked at everything." Daniel's voice was calm but firm. "One more question. Had you ever seen Robert Williams before that night?" "No, I don't think so." "So you saw a homeless person? You assumed he was stealing, and you identified him based on a brief glance while you were busy with other customers. In poor lighting. Someone you'd never seen before. Is that accurate?" The clerk's confidence was crumbling. "I mean, when you put it like that..." "Thank you," Daniel said. No further questions. Judge Morrison watched this exchange with growing interest. Around the courtroom, people were sitting up straighter, paying attention. This wasn't going the way anyone had expected. And Daniel was just getting started. The second day of trial started with a different energy in the courtroom. Word had spread overnight about the teenage lawyer who was holding his own against a seasoned prosecutor. The gallery was packed with curious onlookers, law students, and even a few reporters who'd caught wind of the unusual case. Daniel arrived early, carrying the same worn briefcase, but this time his suit fit better. His client's sister had helped him get it tailored overnight. Small things mattered in a courtroom, and Daniel knew presentation could influence perception. Prosecutor Hutchins looked less confident than the day before. He'd spent the evening reviewing his case files, probably wondering what else he might have missed. He called his next witness, the police officer who had arrested Robert Williams. Officer Bradley Thompson took the stand with the rigid posture of someone who'd testified dozens of times. Hutchins walked him through the arrest, making it sound clean and professional. According to Thompson, they'd received a radio call about the theft, spotted Williams 3 blocks away matching the description, and found merchandise in his backpack when they searched him. "And you're certain the items in the backpack came from Sam's Corner Store?" Hutchins asked. "Absolutely," Thompson replied confidently. The store clerk confirmed it. When Daniel stood up for cross-examination, he had a manila folder in his hand. He approached the witness stand with measured steps. "Officer Thompson, you said you received a radio call about the theft. What time was that?" 6:47 p.m. according to my report. "And you found Mr. Williams at 6:55 p.m., correct?" "That's correct." Daniel opened his folder. "That's 8 minutes. In your report, you stated that Mr. Williams was 3 blocks from the store. Did you time how long it takes to walk 3 blocks from Sam's Corner Store?" Thompson hesitated. "No, I didn't think that was necessary." "I did," Daniel said. "It takes 12 minutes at a normal walking pace. 15 if you're 62 years old with a bad knee, which Mr. Williams has medical records to prove." He pulled out a document. "I'd like to enter this into evidence. A sworn statement from Dr. Helen Park, who treated Mr. Williams at the free clinic 2 weeks before this incident. She confirms his mobility issues." Hutchins stood up. "Objection relevance. Your Honor, if my client physically couldn't have walked that distance in 8 minutes, it raises serious questions about whether he was actually at the store when the theft occurred." Judge Morrison nodded slowly. "Overruled. Continue, Mr. Kim." Daniel turned back to Officer Thompson. "Let's talk about the merchandise you found. In your report, you list 3 items, a package of batteries, a candy bar, and a small bottle of pain medication. Did you photograph these items?" "No, they were just regular items." "Did you check them for price tags from Sam's Corner Store?" Thompson shifted in his seat. "The clerk identified them as stolen from his store." "That's not what I asked. Did you personally verify these specific items came from that specific store? Did they have store tags, security tags, anything linking them definitively to Sam's Corner Store?" The officer's jaw tightened. "The clerk said they were from his store." "Officer Thompson, there are 6 convenience stores within 4 blocks of where you arrested my client. Every single one of them sells batteries, candy bars, and pain medication. Without any identifying marks, you can't actually prove those items came from Sam's Corner Store, can you? The totality of the circumstances, please answer yes or no. Can you definitively prove those items came from that specific store?" A long pause. "No." Daniel let that answer hang in the air. Several jurors were taking notes now. Judge Morrison was leaning forward, her skepticism about Daniel clearly fading. "One final question," Daniel said. "Did you review the security footage from Sam's Corner Store yourself?" "No, that was handled by the detectives." "So you arrested my client based on a description from a clerk who, as we established yesterday, only glanced at the suspect while serving other customers, and you found common items that could have come from any store in the neighborhood. Is that a fair summary?" Hutchins jumped up. "Objection. Argumentative." "Sustained," Judge Morrison said, but the damage was already done. The jury had heard enough. Daniel returned to his table, but he wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. "Your Honor, the defense would like to call our first witness." "I'd like to call Antonio Rodriguez to the stand." A middle-aged man in worn work clothes walked nervously to the witness stand. After being sworn in, he sat down looking uncomfortable in the formal setting. "Mr. Rodriguez, can you tell us what you do for a living?" Daniel asked. "I work maintenance for several buildings downtown. I clean, fix things, whatever needs doing." "And on the evening of March 15th, where were you?" "I was finishing up a job on 5th Street right near Sam's Corner Store." Daniel pulled out a phone and connected it to the courtroom's display screen. "Mr. Rodriguez owns a small cleaning business, and he keeps careful records of his time at each job for billing purposes. This includes time-stamped photos of his work. I'd like to show the jury photo number 15. The screen lit up with an image. It showed the exterior of a building with a timestamp clearly visible, March 15th, 6:42 p.m. And there, in the background, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, was a man sitting on a bench. Daniel zoomed in on the image. "Mr. Rodriguez, who is that person on the bench in the background of your photo?" Antonio looked at the screen, then at Robert Williams. "That's him. The defendant. I remember because he was sitting there when I arrived at 6:30, and he was still there when I left at 7. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Hutchins looked like he'd been slapped. Judge Morrison banged her gavel. "Order. Let him finish," Daniel continued. "So to be clear, you saw Robert Williams sitting on this bench, which is 2 blocks from Sam's corner store, at 6:42 p.m. That's 5 minutes before the theft was even reported to police." "Yes, that's right. He was just sitting there, not bothering anyone. I even gave him a bottle of water because it was hot that day." Daniel showed 3 more photos, each with timestamps, showing Robert Williams in the same location throughout the time period when the theft supposedly occurred. The case was falling apart in real time, but Daniel had saved the best for last. "Your Honor, I have one more piece of evidence. I'd like to present security footage from the parking lot adjacent to Sam's corner store. This footage was never reviewed by the PI, Alice, or the prosecution." He played the video on the courtroom screen. It showed the store's side entrance clearly. A man approached the store, looked around nervously, and went inside. Minutes later, he came out quickly, stuffing something in his jacket. The man was not Robert Williams. He was younger, taller, and had different facial features. But in low light, to someone who wasn't paying close attention, they might look similar. Both had dark clothes, both had beards, both were clearly struggling with homelessness. "This is the real thief," Daniel said quietly. "And nobody bothered to look for him because they'd already decided my client was guilty." The courtroom sat in stunned silence. Hutchins had gone pale. Even Judge Morrison looked shaken. In all her years on the bench, she'd rarely seen such a complete dismantling of a prosecution's case. Daniel looked at the jury, his young face serious and determined. "The system failed Robert Williams. But today, we have a chance to make it right." The courtroom remained silent for what felt like forever after Daniel finished presenting his evidence. Judge Morrison sat back in her chair, her expression grave. Prosecutor Hutchins stared at his notes, his face flushed with embarrassment. The jurors looked at each other, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Judge Morrison finally broke the silence. "Mr. Hutchins, I'm going to give you a moment to confer with your office. We'll take a 15-minute recess." As people filed out for the break, Daniel sat down next to his client. Robert Williams, the homeless veteran at the center of this whole case, had tears streaming down his weathered face. His hands trembled as he grabbed Daniel's arm. "You did it," Robert whispered, his voice cracking. "You actually did it. I thought nobody would ever believe me." Daniel felt his own eyes getting wet. "Mr. Williams, you deserved someone who would fight for you. I'm just glad I could be that person." During the recess, something unusual happened in the hallway outside the courtroom. Other attorneys who'd been watching from the gallery started approaching Daniel. They introduced themselves, handed him business cards, told him they'd been impressed by his work. One older attorney, a woman who'd been practicing law for 30 years, pulled him aside. "I've never seen anyone tear apart a case like that," she said. "Especially not someone fresh out of law school. You have a real gift, son." When everyone returned to the courtroom, Hutchins looked defeated. He stood slowly, his usual confidence completely gone. "Your Honor," he began, his voice subdued. "After reviewing the evidence presented by the defense, the prosecution moves to dismiss all charges against Robert Williams. It's clear that we charged the wrong person, and I apologize to Mr. Williams and to this court for wasting everyone's time." Judge Morrison nodded. "Motion granted, Mr. Williams. You are free to go. All charges are dismissed with prejudice, meaning they cannot be brought against you again." Robert broke down completely, sobbing into his hands. His sister, who'd been sitting in the gallery, rushed forward to embrace him. Around the courtroom, several people were wiping their eyes. Even the bailiff looked emotional. But Judge Morrison wasn't finished. She turned her attention to Daniel, and her expression was serious. "Mr. Kim, please approach the bench." Daniel walked forward, unsure what was coming. The judge gestured for both attorneys to come closer, and they huddled near her bench where the jury couldn't hear. "Mr. Kim," Judge Morrison said quietly, "when you walked into my courtroom yesterday, I made assumptions about you based purely on your age and appearance. I was dismissive. I was rude. And I was wrong." She paused, and for the first time Daniel saw genuine emotion in her eyes. "In 23 years on this bench, I've seen thousands of attorneys. Most are competent. Some are excellent. Very few are exceptional. What you did here, the investigation, the attention to detail, the way you fought for your client, that was exceptional." She looked at Hutchins. "Mr. Hutchins, I'm ordering a full review of this case. I want to know how evidence this exonerating was never found by the police or your office. This man almost went to jail for a crime he didn't commit, and that's unacceptable." Hutchins nodded, looking thoroughly chastened. "Yes, Your Honor, I'll personally oversee the review." Judge Morrison turned back to Daniel. "I owe you an apology, and I owe Mr. Williams an apology. Justice should be blind, and that includes being blind to age and appearance. You've reminded me of that today." After the judge dismissed everyone, the courtroom erupted in activity. Reporters tried to get statements. Robert's family surrounded Daniel, thanking him repeatedly. Other attorneys waiting for their cases to be called stopped to congratulate him. Robert pulled Daniel aside one more time. "I don't have money to pay you," he said, his voice heavy with guilt. "I know you took this case for free, but you deserve—" "Mr. Williams," Daniel interrupted gently, "you don't owe me anything. This is why I became a lawyer. My father went through something similar when I was a kid. He didn't have anyone to fight for him. I promised myself that if I ever got the chance, I'd be that person for someone else. You gave me that chance." Over the next few days, Daniel's life changed dramatically. The local news picked up the story. Teen attorney exposes police failure, saves innocent man. The video clip of him presenting his evidence went viral on social media. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. Law firms that had rejected him months earlier were now calling, offering him positions. But the call that mattered most came from Judge Morrison herself. She'd reached out to contacts at one of the city's most prestigious civil rights law firms, personally vouching for Daniel's abilities. "They want to meet with you," she told him over the phone. "They handle cases just like this one. Wrongful convictions, police misconduct, people who've been failed by the system. I think you'd be a perfect fit." 3 weeks later, Daniel started his new job at Morrison & Associates. No relation to the judge, just a coincidence. The firm specialized in criminal defense and civil rights cases, taking on clients who couldn't afford representation. It was exactly what Daniel had dreamed of doing. His first day, the senior partner called him into her office. She was a formidable woman named Patricia Hayes, who'd built the firm from nothing 30 years ago. "I watched the footage of your trial," she said. "Judge Morrison sent it to me. You know what impressed me most? It wasn't your legal knowledge, though that was strong. It wasn't even the investigation, though that was thorough. It was that you never forgot who you were fighting for. Every question, every piece of evidence, every argument, it was all about getting justice for Robert Williams. That's rare. Most lawyers forget that somewhere along the way." She handed him a file. "This is your first official case. Another wrongful accusation. Another person the system is failing. Think you can handle it?" Daniel took the file, feeling the weight of responsibility but also a surge of purpose. "Yes, ma'am. I can handle it." 6 months later, Robert Williams came to visit Daniel at his office. He was looking healthier, cleaner, more put together. He'd found a place to stay through a veterans program and was getting help for his PTSD. "I got a job," Robert said proudly. "Nothing fancy, just stocking shelves at a warehouse. But it's honest work, and they were willing to give me a chance despite everything." Daniel stood up and shook his hand. "I'm proud of you, Mr. Williams," Robert smiled. "I'm alive because of you. Not just alive, but actually living again. You gave me my dignity back. You believed me when nobody else would." He paused, his eyes getting misty. "You saved my life, Daniel. I'll never forget that." After Robert left, Daniel sat at his desk and looked at the photo on his wall. A picture of his father on the day his conviction was overturned, smiling wider than Daniel had ever seen. Next to it was a newspaper clipping about his own case with Robert Williams. His secretary knocked on the door. "Your next client is here. Another tough case." Everyone else turned it down. Daniel smiled. Send them in. This was his purpose. This was why he'd pushed through all the doubt, all the rejection, all the people who said he was too young or too inexperienced. The system wasn't perfect, but people like Daniel could make it a little more just, one case at a time. And that 17-year-old kid who'd walked into Judge Morrison's courtroom, He wasn't just a lawyer anymore. He was exactly what his father had needed all those years ago. A fighter, a believer, someone who wouldn't give up until justice was served. The journey was just beginning.